Try and imagine that you're in a phone box next to the Empire State Building, and then the Atlantic Ocean sweeps in, then all the lights go out, then you start bleeding oxygen. Then you know that rescue is at least 2 days away, and what you've got to do is preserve your oxygen as long as you can.
Stephen McGinty, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
We are talking about the world's deepest submarine rescue today.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. It's the subject of my new book, The Dive, which is the untold story of the world's deepest submarine rescue. And yeah, it's an incredible story from the analog age of 1973. The background to it is effectively that just to get people kind of in the mood. It's really from the time when in 1973 when new phone lines were laid down, and there was what's known as the Cantat cable was laid between Canada and the United Kingdom, and this was high technology. You know, this was a cable that allowed 1,750 phone calls to be made from the entirety of America and Canada to the UK at any one time. So this was the days when it would be like £3.50 a minute to make a phone call transatlantic. But this was the cable. In fact, this new cable was 3 times what previous cables had done. And what was happening at the time was that the cable had been laid, but these miniature submarines, this Pisces III, was being sent down to do a simple but very important job, which was to find the cable and to dig a little ditch so that the cable would then settle into the ditch and then be covered over by sand and silt. The idea being that while it was on the surface, I mean, this was 150 miles off the coast of Cork, so it was in the Atlantic Ocean, but it was still in an area where people were fishing, and the fear was that nets would go down or trawlers, and effectively the cable could be hauled back up. And as I said in the book, you know, Murphy's Law does apply within 150 miles of Ireland, and the fear was that they obviously needed to tackle that. So on the day back in August 1973, there was 2 men in this small Pisces III mini submersible. There was Roger Chapman and there was Roger Mallinson. Roger Chapman was ex-Royal Navy. He was an ex-nuclear submariner who'd effectively had to leave the services because his eyesight wasn't as good as it should have been, and he moved into the private sector. And at the time, what was interesting about it was the company that ran the submarines was Vickers Oceanics. Now, Vickers, as anyone from Barrow and Furness and anyone who knows about the great kind of nautical history of Britain will know, Vickers was the titan of sort of shipbuilders, and particularly military and sort of naval ships from the First World War, Second World War, and into the Cold War. So what they did was that they would obviously be making these massive ships, but they decided that it was 1973, there had been the boom in the North Sea oil industry, and they decided miniature submarines were going to be an effective gadget, effectively, that the industry would have been needed. And this little miniature submarine had been invented by these incredible Canadians. There was a guy called Al Trice, and Al Trice back in the early 1960s was from Vancouver, and he was one of the pioneers of he was a great salvage diver. Those were the days where you wore hard hats, you went down with kind of heavy steel boots, and he pioneered some of the deepest dives. I mean, they were doing bounce dives in those days, so that basically meant that you would go down as deep as maybe 350 feet, but you could be down there for literally 2 or 3 minutes, and then you would take these long, slow ascents to the surface to avoid the bends. Al Trice said, "Look, there has to be a practical device. There has to be let's develop a submarine that's small, that's commercial." The French had developed the bathyscope, which had gone right down to the kind of Marinara Trench, effectively. But he wanted to develop effectively a commercial submarine. And these guys, who could come into the story later on, effectively what they did was they spent their money, they pioneered and created the Pisces craft. And what was interesting about Pisces miniature submarine was that they tested it in Vancouver on a day that the US Navy were testing anti-submarine missiles. And what I find fascinating about the Pisces craft was that it managed, on its test dive, it managed to evade a missile that had been sent out whose principal job was effectively to track down submarines, and there's something about it that says that this thing was maybe indestructible, but also lucky.
So talk us through the craft. What's Pisces III? How big is it
Pisces,
inside? What does it have?
It's small. Well, the way I kind of when I've told people about this book was effectively to try and imagine that you and your friend are in a large phone box. That's the way to think of it. And the way that I kind of sold it to people was, imagine that you're in a phone box, and the phone box is sitting slap bang next to the Empire State Building, and then you watch as the Atlantic Ocean rolls in to a height 10 stories above the top of the Empire State Building. So that's the kind of the size of it was pretty compact, so 5 or 6 feet in diameter, but enough to move around in. But you got pretty close.
All right, so set the scene. We're on the day of this occurring. Yep. What's Roger and Roger doing, and why? How do they get down there?
Well, what they did is on the surface was at the kind of the mothership, which is effectively a large converted trawler called the Vicar Voyager. So that was on the surface, and that was operating 24 hours a day. The Pisces submarine was on deck, and they, round about 1 o'clock in the morning, they climbed into the submarine. It was winched over the edge. It was then dropped down into the water. Then it was towed out to a certain point. And what was interesting at the time was that what they would do is they would attach like a buoy to the surface, and then they would attach a rope to the submarine, and then the submarine would descend right down to the bottom, so 1,600 feet to the bottom. And then they would, on the surface, they would follow this buoy as it went along. So that was, if you think about Jaws, that's effectively what it was like when they fired the barrels into the Great White. That's effectively what they were doing with the submarine. So they go down to the bottom. They spend 8 or 9 hours on the bottom, digging this little trench and watching the cable drop in. And they had a tape recorder down there, and Roger, when he was down there, Roger Mallinson, liked to listen to. Now, this was 1973, so this was the year of Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. There was all sorts of great albums released in 1973. But Roger Mallinson liked to listen to Mozart and Bach's organ music. He always insisted that the sound, because of the sphere, the sound inside the submarine was fantastic, and that's what he used to listen to. He was he is an eccentric character, Roger, and a great man. So the two of them were down there, and then after about 8 or 9 hours, they rose to the surface, and then what happened was a big fluke. They get to the surface, and then the team that come out on a kind of little craft, and they begin to tow it back in. But what happens is a rope is that's used to tow them. It knots over the back of the submarine, and the rope knots round a bolt on the aft sphere, which is the back of the submarine. And unfortunately, that's not covered, and the bolt is tightened, and the pressure inside the aft sphere, it basically flips open. So suddenly they're on the surface, and the aft sphere, which is the back of the submarine, but which is not connected, although it's part of the submarine, there's no it's solid effectively between that and the actual compartment where the men are. But what happens is a ton of water suddenly floods into the back of the aft sphere, so the submarine is incredibly overweighted and immediately begins to tip butt first and begins to sink down. Now, the key point here is that before this happened, they disconnected the buoy. So the buoy that told them where the submarine was had been disconnected.
The position marker is no longer there.
Exactly. So the submarine falls. First of all, it drops to 160 feet, which is where the end of the tow rope is. So the tow rope catches it, but they know there's no way the tow rope can withstand the weight. So Roger and Mallinson and Roger Chapman are desperately trying to drop a kind of heavy weight that's attached to the submarine to try and lighten the load to buy themselves a bit more time. There's talk of a diver trying to get down to attach a rope to it. But then what happens is, just as they've managed to get this weight off, there's a massive crack, and the weight drops, but also the rope snaps, and suddenly they're plummeting right down to the bottom. And Roger talked about how the water being driving through the engines sounded like a Stuka dive bomber. So they're plummeting down. Roger, they're trying to sort of get everything out of the way because they know they're going to crash land on the bottom. Roger tells them to start. Roger Mallinson remembers that it's just in case they bite their tongue off with the impact, they stuff rags in their mouth, and then they finally hit the bottom. Bang.
What sort of speeds are they going when they do that?
Well, it's about, I mean, it's a good question. Initially they thought it would be like, 20, 30 miles an hour, but I'm not sure it was as fast as that. But it was certainly enough that they were fearful that it could crack open. But what happens is they smash down onto the bottom, and suddenly they're in pitch darkness. And initially they were waiting, thinking, so they knew they were on the bottom. They knew they were deeper than any other submarine who'd been rescued. And the first thing they were fearful of was there cracks in the submarine? So they checked there's no cracks in the submarine. The next thing they're fearful of is that although they know they have oxygen supply down there, the key problem in a submarine is effectively not the oxygen that you're breathing in, but the carbon dioxide that you're breathing out. So they know that they have a scrubber, which is effectively like a little electric motor, which scrubs out the oxygen. It sucks the oxygen in, scrubs it, takes out the carbon dioxide, and then they bleed in oxygen back into the chamber, so it maintains a safe atmosphere effectively. But they can only do that if the batteries are working. And also they're fearful that if there's a problem with one of the fuses or with the cables on the battery, that it could ignite. And obviously there had been the fire on board one of the Apollo missions just a few years previous to that, but that's a major concern that they could trigger a fire.
That they could have, one of the wires could have been broken during the fall or something like that.
Exactly, and it could trigger a fire inside, and then they're gone.
Weren't they only a small distance from some huge ledge in the sea floor that would have dropped them down to some insane depth?
Well, that was the concern. They thought they were maybe within a half a mile or a mile of that, but they didn't know how far they drifted, because that was the key point, was that there was the current was quite strong and they were drifting as they fell. So yeah, the concern was when they were falling, they were looking at the depth going up 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, and they didn't know that. They knew that they were their deepest. They were at 1,700 feet when they were operating, and they thought had they gone deeper than that, then they would have been in. I mean, I think it would drop down to about 3,000 feet. But one break that didn't happen. But they are, when they realise what's happening, they're at sort of 1,650 feet, and I mean that the way I, as I say, described it was trying to imagine that you're in a phone box next to the Empire State Building, and then the Atlantic Ocean sweeps in, then all the lights go out, then you start bleeding oxygen, then you know that rescue is at least 2 days away, and what you've got to do is preserve your oxygen as long as you can.
Why do they know that it's at least 2 days away?
Because this is the problem, and this is what makes the rescue such an incredible feat. Above them is Vickers Voyager, and the only way that they can be rescued is for a diver can't get down to that depth. So the only way is for another submarine to get down to that depth and attach a rescue rope. Now, the submarines that are capable of doing that is Pisces II, which is in the North Sea, Pisces V, which is in Canada, and also the Curve, which is run by the US Navy, which is a remote-controlled sort of miniature submarine, which had been used a number of years before, or maybe 4 or 5 years before, to pick up an A-bomb, there had been a plane crash above Spain. One of these bombs had dropped off the Spanish coast, and it was Curve that had been sent down to finally find the submarine, find the bomb and bring it to the surface. So as they're sitting there, they know that the only thing that can rescue them is a submarine which is either in the North Sea, Canada, or the United States, and that the submarine, the safety vessel above them, the Vickers Voyager, that has to leave them, go back to Cork to pick up these teams. But effectively what happens is they're on the seabed, and then a massive international rescue is put into operation. Vickers Oceanic at the time was one of the general managers there was Peter Messervary. He was ex-Navy, and he himself had been stuck in the submarine 600 feet down in Vancouver during a test a few years before. So he knew exactly what they were going through. And at the time, what they did was they put in a kind of a rescue operation, which was belt and braces and then belts again. So they got the submarine from the North Sea. They got that on another vessel, and they started steaming back into port. They contacted the Canadians and said, "We're going to have to get you guys over." And what was great was that Al Trice, who devised and invented effectively the Pisces submarine, he was actually in London at the time, so he was able to take part in the rescue as well. But he contacted the Canadians were contacted, and they basically swung into action. They loaded everything up onto trucks and contacted the Canadian Air Force. And the Canadian Air Force said, "Look, don't worry about the paperwork. We've got a Hercules aircraft ready for you. Just whenever you can get to the airport, we'll have this Hercules ready."
Isn't it a sub smash or something? Wasn't there like some huge red button that somebody pressed that marshals the entire world's forces to try and help?
Yeah. That was the Royal Navy, the sub smash, which is basically there's a submarine in trouble and all help is available. But effectively, what was interesting was it was the Vickers, the Canadians, and the Americans. And the Americans were all based in San Diego, so they did the same thing. They rushed to the raid, loaded up two Hercules aircrafts, and within 10, 12 hours, you've got these Hercules aircraft, one flying from San Diego, one flying from Canada, and the other team arriving into Cork. So then what you have is Vickers, the Venture on the surface, has to leave them. Another fishing vessel comes and stays on the point, because the point is they don't know. They, as I've said in the book, they know roughly where they are. I.e., they know there's a haystack. They just don't know where the needle is. So the vessel,
because they'd lost that buoy. They'd lost the locator buoy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they head to back to Cork, and that's effectively where the Voyager was laden with the two submarines.
So back down in the submarine, what do the Rogers do now? They land there, and then they decide to test the batteries. And what are the resources they need to balance? What do they do now?
Yeah, well, effectively what they do is they know that the scrubber's operating, so that they know that they can take the carbon dioxide out the atmosphere and replace it with kind of oxygen. So that's okay. They've got to keep the batteries going, and they know that initially the way they operated was the oxygen they had down there. If they were acting normally, chatting, moving about, that would probably last 30, 35 hours. But the estimate was that if they just lay down, remained as silent as possible, remained as calm as possible, they could extend that till about 65, 70 hours, which was the kind of roughly when the operation if they could get there, they figured they could get there within maybe 50 hours. So it was incredibly stressful and incredibly tense.
In a time when they need to specifically be as calm as possible, low heart rate, low breathing rate.
Absolutely. And Roger Mallinson always said that if he had to be stuck in a submarine with anyone, he was so glad it was Roger Chapman, because Roger Chapman was ex-Navy. And both of them were terrified, but both of them had that stiff British upper lip, which is, I'm terrified, but I'm fine. I'm absolutely fine, and I'm going to operate as if I'm fine.
So they moved.
They were eternalizing it.
Yeah. They moved the entire they feng shuied the whole internal compartment around so that they only needed to move a tiny amount to check on the few different bits and pieces. Yeah,
they moved what they could effectively, because of the way the submarine had landed, which is kind of butt first into the sand. They had to move their kind of benches around, and then they reconfigured it effectively so that they could fit. They moved the minimum amount as possible, so that it was just as easy as possible for them.
How are they communicating with the surface?
Well, there's an underwater telephone, which is effectively what they used. And what was interesting about it was, it was very staticky and very kind of you could hear. But what was fascinating was that there was a lot of porpoises and dolphins in the area, and the dolphins would squeak, and they would, as Roger Mallinson said, you would lose messages to the dolphins because they would be making this kind of noise, and he didn't mind it so much because he loved the dolphins. But that was another element of it. But they could it was effectively like an underwater radio that was operating.
So they had a timer thing, right? They were doing something every half an hour. Tell us about that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, effectively, the best practice was effectively to operate the scrubber every 30 minutes, so that it would take out the kind of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But what they did was, and they had a timer to do that, so that they would either, if they fell asleep, or they would always do it, the timer would go off. But effectively, what they did was, in order to maintain the scrubber, so that the chemicals that they could only replace a certain amount of time, in order to extend that, they started pushing it further and further. So in ideal situations, they would do it every half an hour. But sometimes they would do it. They would go an hour, 90 minutes without doing it, in order to kind of maintain the resources as long as possible.
What were the effects of being down there? Because I imagine condensation. Well,
their food supplies were very limited. They had like one sandwich. They had a tin of Corona lemonade. They had half a flask of coffee. They had some ship's biscuits, and that was it.
What about water? No water.
No water. Which is incredible. But so what they started doing was that the condensation that built up on the edge of the submarine, they would run their hands down that, and they would kind of dab their lips that way. So it was a tough environment.
Half a canister of coffee. Was it like a cheese and ploughman sandwich or something?
Yeah, because Mallinson had jam sandwiches, which he'd eaten,
and then a tin of lemonade.
Yeah,
and some condensation.
Yeah, and that's what you've got for 3 days.
How long? I mean, 3 days must be close to the hydration limit for humans.
Yeah. I mean, it was something that they were. Yeah, it was kind of tough for them, but they managed to get what they could from the walls of the submarine.
Okay, so we've got them down there.
Yeah,
they're trying to stay as still as they can every half an hour to every hour. They're waking up to play around with the oxygen, leak the oxygen back in, also scrub the CO2 out. What's happening on the surface?
Well, on the surface, the first thing is Voyager finally gets another ship to sort of maintain position on the surface. Then Voyager sails 13, 14 hours back to Cork. By that time, the Pisces submarine that was in the North Sea has been brought over to Cork. They wait for the Pisces from Canada to arrive by Hercules. They unload that. They get that onto the Voyager. And then what's interesting, two things are interesting. Al Trice is delayed in getting over to Cork. So the captain of Voyager said, we're not waiting for him. So they sail off. And then what happens is Trice has to be helicoptered out into the Atlantic and then lowered down onto Voyager. In fact,
there's no helipad on Voyager.
There's no helipad on Voyager. They're lowered down. And also what's happening is when I found the logs from Vickers from the Vickers company, there's a lovely line where it says something like 12:30, Al Trice dropped, full stop, onto Voyager, brackets, gently, full stop. Because it gave the indication they just dropped him on. But it was the brackets, gently, that I really, again, that's the beauty of when you're writing a book. You find these little pieces of paperwork and it gives you an indication of it. So what happened then was, now the Americans were delayed. So the Americans, because they were obviously flying from the West Coast, they were delayed. So they get into Cork about 10 hours later, and they have to wait because of the tidal effect. Their ship is put onto another ship, and they're 10 hours behind Vickers Voyager. So Voyager gets back to the scene of the accident on the early hours of Friday morning. So they're there. So 40 hours later, they're on the scene, and then effectively there's a great line which says, "How do you make God laugh?" And it's tell him your plans. Because what happened was Miss Every had an idea that they would get to the point, they would send down one of the Pisces submarines, and they would hook them up, get them to the surface. And the idea was they'd be up by breakfast. So first thing goes wrong is they try and get these kind of inflatable crafts that just inflatable kind of boats that would take them out to roughly the site where they think that the submarine sinks. But the first engine doesn't work, the second engine doesn't work. Eventually, they have to get another engine sent over from one of the naval vessels, and that's just to tow out the Pisces craft. Now, they make a decision. They're going down with a rope bound onto a kind of like a clamp, like a kind of claw, effectively, at the front of the Pisces. And they make a decision that they want the rope to be of a certain buoyancy, the idea being that it would float up above them and would be less likely to become entangled. The problem is that submarine goes down, and it's piloted by a great guy called Des Darcy, and it goes down, down, down. The problem is that the deeper it goes, the greater the buoyancy on the rope. And effectively what happens is they get down to about 1,300 feet, and the buoyancy of the rope, the tension on that starts pulling on the claw, and effectively go hit about 1,400 feet, and then it gives. So not only does the rope and with the hook pull out of the claw, but it mangles the claw. So they're in a position where they no longer have a rope and they no longer have a working claw on this submarine. The decision's made to send down the submarine anyway in an attempt to try and find Pisces, but after a few hours, they can't find it. And no, that's the other thing. At some point, that Pisces, that submarine springs a leak, or there's a tension on board, so they have to go back up to the surface. So that's the first dive, which was deemed to be, the idea would be that it would be very successful, but that doesn't work. So then they bring on board the Canadians. So Al Trice and his team in another Pisces submarine, they're towed out, and dive 2 goes down to the bottom. The problem is it gets down to the bottom and it's there for 8 hours and it can't find Pisces III.
How are they doing that? Just simply by sight, shine a light?
By sonar, effectively. So what happens is they've got a sonar down there, and they're kind of they're scanning, they're twisting around and they're scanning, trying to find it. And at one point they get a ping, but what effectively is when they look at the scale of it, they realise that they're 1 mile away. So under the water at that distance with that kind of parameter, it's difficult. If you were maybe 500, 600, 700 feet away, it would still be tough to find it, to get it to the point where you could actually illuminate it. So they're down there for 8 hours, no luck. They go back to the surface. At this point, the claw's being worked on in the other submarine. They go back down again, and what they do is they get Roger Chapman to sing. At one point, Chapman's singing this made-up song in the hope that they can hear them. The idea is the higher notes might help. So Chapman's singing away, and they get the team in the Canadian submarine are desperately trying to sort of find exactly the right spot, and eventually what is a combination of both Mallinson and Chapman hearing a directional change on their kind of underwater telephone. So it's a combination of them thinking they've made some kind of change on the Canadians' ship, and the Canadians thinking, right, we've locked onto them.
Can they communicate with the Canadians? Yeah,
well, this is the thing. They can at some point. It's and because at one point, Mallinson keeps talking, and the Canadians at one point saying, quiet please, and Mallinson starts getting pissed off, pardon the language, because of this is what's happened. And the other thing that annoys the Chapman and Mallinson is that the Canadians are talking about meters, and these guys are saying, well, what we're dealing in feet here, we have to deal in feet. So it's like the old world and the new world kind of clashing. So eventually, at one point, they finally realise they lock on to where they think they are, and Mallinson is looking up at the porthole, which is almost like a skylight at that point because of the way the submarine is facing. And what they're looking for is they're looking out into just a wash of blackness. But what they're waiting for is for light to come, because the idea being that the other submarine has lights on it, and if the blackness out there starts to illuminate, then they know they're going to be found. So eventually what happens is they see the light in the water, and they realise that Pisces 5, that the Canadians have found them, and they think, fantastic. So what happens is the Canadians position their submarine really close to Pisces, and what they're trying to do is they've got a device that they're trying to sort of hook onto the top of the rope, so the top of the submarine, and they're positioning it with their hook, and as I've described it in the book, it's effectively like threading a needle wearing a suit of armour. But they've done it before. They're good at it. This is what they do. But what happens is they put the hook into the eye at the top of Pisces III, and they think they've locked on. So for a second, effectively, they've got this rope with the lifting strength to get them up, and it's locked on. But then, again, a 1 in 1,000 misfortune, it just falls out. It spins round effectively and drops out of sight. So there's a situation where they have to spin round the submarine, which bangs Pisces III, and they're trying to chase this rope as it drifts away. And as I've said, it's like a pensioner's race, because the rope is just drifting very slowly, like a balloon caught in a breeze. But they can only move very slowly, and they're desperately trying to kind of catch it before it goes away. Because if it drifts out of arm reach, effectively, or if they miss it, they're going to have to go back to the surface, which is a few hours, find it, retool, get back down again. The bottom line is they get down, but the problem is they can't get it back onto the lift point. The only thing they can do is fit it onto a grill, which is over one of the propellers, which allows them to know exactly where the submarine is, but won't support the weight.
Oh, so they would use that as kind of like a Minotaur's maze way to follow it down. It might not have the buoy attached to the top, but all that you would do in future is now send a submarine, okay, just track with this in sight, down. Okay.
But the problem is, but the major problem is it won't support the weight of the submarine, so they can't lift.
What about the Roger and Roger at the moment? Have they not needed to go to the bathroom? Have they not been struggling with stuff like that?
Yeah. They've no choice. I mean, it's not pretty, but in the book we have to describe how they have to go to the toilet, which is effectively just, without putting too fine a point of it, is defecating in a plastic bag and then putting the bag inside a kind of a sealed metal biscuit tin. So that's the reality.
Didn't one of the lads have the runs as well? Hadn't he had a bad pie or something?
Yeah, well, that was it. He'd been constipated for a while, and he just could hold on no longer. But as he said afterwards, the relief afterwards was overwhelming. So that's where they are. The Canadians have found them, but the Canadians eventually have to go back up.
How many hours in are we here?
Oh, we're about 50 hours, 55. I mean, they're getting very close to the wire. So then what happens is there's a third trip down to try and get another rope on. Doesn't work. Is
that another Pisces that time?
That's another Pisces trip down. But basically what happens is by the Friday night, and they know that by Saturday lunchtime they're out of oxygen. By Friday night, they still don't have a working lift line on. And then there's this great sequence whereby you've got people like Ted Carter. Ted Carter is in Barrow-in-Furness, and Ted Carter's a kind of assistant technical manager, and he's communicating with Voyager on the radio, and he realizes that they are despondent, that they are exhausted, and that the rescue is not happening the way it should be. So he decides that they should send out another team of kind of fresh men, and he speaks to Leonard Redshaw. Leonard Redshaw was known as Mr. Polaris because he effectively worked with the Navy to design the Polaris submarine. He was the Britain's shipbuilder effectively, and he was in charge of Vickers. And his idea was we throw everything at this kind of rescue mission. So he spoke to Leonard Redshaw, and Redshaw said, "Yeah, great, put together a team." So what happened is you've got this kind of like Dirty Dozen mission whereby Ted puts together a team of kind of men, kind of engineers, divers, 5 of them. They are flown in the sort of small private plane that Vickers have over to Cork. The Royal Navy have got permission to fly into sort of Irish airspace, and the Irish have been very supportive of it. They touch down at Cork Airport. They run across the tarmac, and they're loaded onto a Sea King helicopter. Problem is, the helicopter's got to fly 150 miles out, and there's a storm, so the weather's atrocious. None of these guys have been on a helicopter before. What happens is they fly out in the storm, and as one of the guys I was speaking to about it said, when they looked out, all they could see was white. They thought it was snow, but it was the tops of the waves just being whipped up by the weather. And they are at kind of 9-10 at night. They're lowered down in the midst of this storm onto the deck of Voyager, which is thrashing about. And what happens is they get lowered down one at a time, but every time they're about to touch the deck, the Voyager sinks into a wave. So they think they're about to touch the ground, but the ground just falls underneath them. And it's just this kind of amazing piece of piloting. In fact, the pilot had got in touch with me after the book came out, and he was commended, and as for the piloting that was involved in that and keeping it steady and lowering these men down. So Ted gets down there with his team on the Friday evening, and he helps fix one of the submarines, and he goes down with Des Darcy on the kind of early hours of Saturday morning. And it's Ted, effectively, this guy who was in Barrow-in-Furness, 12 hours before, who helps get the first actual lift line. They developed a toggle, which is effectively like an upside-down umbrella. And the idea would be that this would be fitted into the aft sphere, and like a T-bar, it would open out once it was in. And they managed to get the first one in. But at the same time, the Americans had got out there finally, and what again? How do you make God laugh? Telling your plans. The idea was that they would launch first. That they had this high technology for 1973, remote-controlled submarine, effectively, that was like a kind of, as they said, it was like a dog on a leash, a well-trained dog on a leash that could be sent down and had CCTV cameras fixed on it. And that was supposed to launch about 11 at night on the Friday night. And just as they're about to power it up, it's a massive kind of power grid for it. What they didn't appreciate was when they'd been wiring it all up on the journey out, salt water and sea spray had contaminated all the circuits. So as soon as they pressed it up, as soon as effectively they powered it up, the whole thing just blew. So again, there's submarines aren't working on Voyager. The Americans are supposed to come and rescue everyone. Bang, they blew. And it was going to take 4 hours to rewire the entire system with everyone working at once. And again, it's that kind of system whereby, because they had so many resources out there, now granted, every system had its own problems. What happened was Ted goes down in Pisces, gets that lift line attached, but they realise that they need another lift line.
One's not going to be enough.
It could potentially be enough, but it's too heavy to risk it. They want to get another lift line.
Because if they drop it a second time...
Yeah, that's it. They've literally got one chance with the lift. So what they do is the Americans are finally brought in on about 4, 5 in the morning. And what's fantastic is after everything that's gone wrong with every other attempt, the Americans goes absolutely like silk. It goes like clockwork. The curve is piloted down by Larry Brady, who sadly just died a couple of weeks ago. But he pilots it, brings it down, and drops off another toggle into the aft sphere. And as he described it to me, he said it was like parking the car after a very, very long drive. A drive of effectively 3 days, but it just goes that smoothly. So by 10 o'clock in the morning, they've got maybe they estimate they've got a few hours of oxygen left, but potentially less. No one's has an absolute accurate account of how much oxygen's left. They're in the position where they're going to lift.
What are Roger and Roger like at this stage? What sort of physiological state are they in?
Well, they're exhausted. They're stressed. They're imagining the worst. Because Mallinson they're both amazing guys, but kind of Mallinson really knows the submarine, and he's constantly overthinking what they should be doing and trying to second guess it. And Chapman's the one who's trying to sort of calm him down, just saying, look, Chapman's attitude is that there's nothing we can do here, but effectively try and be silent and breathe as little as possible. Whereas Mallinson is effectively trying to second guess and make suggestions about what they can do and really try and work out it. So when it becomes to time to lift the submarine, they are both internalizing it, but as they admitted afterwards, terrified, because in their heads they can't quite grasp what the toggle is. They think it's a hook, and they're constantly worried that like a fish on a hook, the fish is going to come off the hook. And initially what happens is when they start to lift, the submarine is being dragged along the surface, and it's only after a certain point that it starts to lift up.
It's until it gets to the plumb straight line, right, exactly, below wherever it is. Yeah.
It's lifted up. And as they said later on, the worst part of the entire experience was the lift, was those final 2 hours. Because what happened was that it was being lifted from a different ship this time. They transferred over to a kind of larger vessel that was going to that was actually operating where Curve, the Americans, had been operating from. And what they did was they kind of moved over to the John Cabot. That was it. It was the Canadian Coast Guard. It was an icebreaker that they were moving off from, that they decided to operate the lift from. And what happened was that because of the stormy weather, this icebreaker was constantly being forced up and down 20, 30 feet because of the waves. So if you imagine you're fishing and you've got a fish at the end of the hook, but that fish is a submarine, it's constantly going up and down, and it's pivoting as it goes up. So it was like a kind of a really violent roller coaster for them. And they're terrified because every motion of the submarine, they're smashing about inside, but they also think that the hooks are going to come off and they're going to plummet down to the bottom. Also, communications breaking up. So at one point they're shouting for them to stop the lift. They can't get it to stop. The other guys think they want to continue. There's a lot of confusion. And then they stop at one point when the curve, which is the kind of American system, that submarine has wrapped around at one point the Pisces, so that they're lifting both at once. It all gets very confusing and very kind of stressful. But at one point they stop, and that's because they get to about 120 feet from the surface, and Messervy decides we've got to get another line on there. Once it gets to the surface, it's going to get heavier. So there's a great situation where they send down the divers to try and attach another rope to it, and it's Bob. Who was it? Bob Hanley. Bob Hanley is sent down as a diver with one of his colleagues with a hook. And the idea is, as he described it, is trying to land in a bucking bronco. So the submarine itself is thrashing about, moving up and down, and he's got to time his dive so that he can land on it and effectively straddle it like you would a bucking bronco while it's moving up and down with the waves at the top. And he's holding the rope with this kind of hook that he's trying to sort of wedge. No, in fact, that's not it. What it is it's a really thick rope attached to a U-curve with a bolt attached to it, and the bolt's attached to a string. And what he has to do is he has to get the U-bend of the metal sort of stanchion effectively under the top of the submarine. Then he has to screw in a bolt, like a carabiner, to sort of close off the opening. Yeah, exactly. And all while underwater at 120 feet on a submarine that's thrashing about. And it's an incredibly tense moment, but he manages to get it on. And they effectively send down another rope. And so we're in a position where there's all these three ropes pulling up. And finally, they make it to the surface with, a very tense moment. Okay, so they get to the surface, and then there's still complications then, right? Like getting the hatch open. And yeah. Mallinson always remembers that they bled in more oxygen. Didn't they? When did they eat the sandwich? Well, good question. I think they ate it at some point, but they celebrated with they cracked open the Corona lemonade as soon as they were found. That was their deal, is that they wouldn't open the lemonade until they were found. So they cracked open the lemonade then. And as Mallinson said, remember, because of everything that'd been going on, it can taste like shit. But shit never tasted so sweet, given the conditions they were in. But when they got to the surface, they were. Mallinson remembers it very vividly. They couldn't get the actual hatch open, so he was kind of kicking it and lying on the bottom and kicking the surface of the hatch. Even though they're at the surface, this doesn't give them any more oxygen or any more CO2 scrubbing, right? You could be sealed in on the top of Everest, and it would be precisely the same as being at the bottom of the ocean. Exactly. They've got to get that hatch open to get fresh air in. Finally, bang, the hatches open. And as there's a lovely moment where effectively they said that they had the first argument of the whole time they were down there was then when the hatch was open. Mallinson was the pilot, and Mallinson's argument was that he should be the last person out because he's pilot, he's responsible for the craft. Chapman is much wiser because they're in a storm. The waves are thrashing about, and as Chapman says to Roger, you can't swim. So that was his argument, that Mallinson should be the first person out of the submarine, on the grounds that if water floods in, at least Chapman can swim, because Mallinson's never learned to swim. So eventually they finally get them out, and and what's very touching is that when I was writing the book to people and I was writing about the book, what they'd been rescued by this idea of the Brotherhood of the Sea. All these other vessels had come to their aid. Men had come from Canada, from California, from the North Sea, from Ireland. Everyone had pulled together, and for this 3-day period, the kind of world was waiting, with bated breath to find out, could these men be rescued. It was akin to the situation a couple of years back with the school party trapped in the cave, and I think Thailand it was, where you were waiting to see could they be rescued, and they were rescued. But for the men on board who toiled for so long on Vickers Voyager, they were on the edge of the ship looking out, and when they saw the sub hit the surface and finally see these guys climb out, there was people just bursting into tears. I mean, these were men who'd never, as I'd said, their eyes had been parched for decades. They just didn't cry about anything. But it was just the overwhelming emotion of willing something to happen, and for so many things to go wrong. They finally got them to the surface, and that was part of the reason why I wanted to write the book. Was obviously there was the experience of the men on board, but it was also to capture all these characters who were in danger of being lost to history. Like kind of Al Trice, like Ted Carter, Bob Hanley, all these people who guys who devised the toggles. And when you speak to Ted Carter today, I mean, he's very blasé about it. He just said he helped, but it's they did remarkable things. Larry Brady in California. So that was it. It was everyone had pulled together to pull off this incredible rescue. And when you consider everything that had gone wrong, even to the point where at one point they needed new rope, and the Navy who were out there ferried rope across on a kind of wire basket effectively underneath a helicopter, but they misjudged the weight of the rope. So as soon as the helicopter took off and started flying toward Voyager, they could see the helicopter immediately start being dragged down to the sea. So they suddenly, the helicopter pilot had to jettison the rope, and suddenly the rope's tumbling down, and Al Trice is on the deck of Voyager with Peter Messervy looking out at the rope they're supposed to get, and suddenly the rope's just bobbing across the surface of the Atlantic. And Al Trice had a motto that he used to say, and his attitude was, well, if it was easy, everyone would do it. And this was a rescue that was far from easy.
How close to the wire was it with resources and oxygen and that
stuff?
Well,
it's complicated because afterwards, if you see that there's a little footage of them on YouTube talking about when they finally touched down on Cork, and they're very stiff upper lip British. Everything's fine. Oh, we have plenty of resources. It was very comfortable. At one point, they say on the bottom, it was very comfortable. And the report was that they could have gone for a number of hours afterwards. However, the people I spoke to who had first-hand experience of it, one of them said that it was his job to inspect the submarine when it was finally brought back to Cork, and he was he went into the submarine with the kind of US kind of authority. His job is to monitor safety for submarines, and they said he remembers two things very vividly. One was the stench of the place, the stench of the submarine, and the second thing was that when they turned on the oxygen, just nothing came out. His attitude was that they were just absolutely down to the wire.
Minutes.
Yeah. We'll never know exactly how it's powered back to tell, but his attitude was that there was nothing left.
Yeah, the video of the Rogers talking about it doesn't one of them say what was the worst part of it, and he said coming back up?
Yes, yeah, and I think that's because a lot of what they say is very much that kind of stiff upper British lip saying it's fine, and you have to kind of having put together the book, knowing what preceded it, we can now understand why that was, because it was, I mean, they're being rescued, but it took 2 hours to get them to the surface, and they were being smashed about for a good chunk of that. And when they weren't being smashed about, they were hanging like a fish in a hook, unaware what was happening. And all the time, they know they're at the very limit of what oxygen's left. So it's that thing where when you look at all the components that had to be in place for them to be rescued, the Curve being flown over from California, the Pisces flying over from Halifax, the team coming over from the North Sea, and when you look at all the things that went wrong, all you have to think about is another link in that chain being delayed, or another problem, or something that, like imagine it was 4 hours to fix the Curve electrics to get the sub down. Imagine it took 4.5 or 5. I mean, they were that close, because it wasn't that case of it took a long time to get for the rescue to begin and then the rescue went really smoothly. Literally, everything that could have gone wrong with the rescue did go wrong. but they still managed to get them up. And it's that great line from Winston Churchill: "Never, ever, ever give up." And I think that this rescue is a testament to that.
What did the guys do after this? Did they go back to the sea? Did any of them descend again?
Yeah, both of them. But within a few weeks, they were back in the submarine.
Lads, lads.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mallinson's attitude was, there was errors, but he wanted to get back onto the submarine. And Chapman did it for a spell, but then Chapman used his experiences to set up a company that developed rescue for submarines. So Chapman went on to take his experience and turn it into a very successful business that was involved in that was called upon but not used tragically for the Kursk disaster, but then was called upon to rescue another Russian submarine. I think it was 10, 12 years ago. So he had an amazing experience from it.
Commercialized his catastrophe.
Yeah, absolutely. But what was very, very special about it was that the bond between the two remained up until Roger Chapman sadly died a year ago in January, I think it was. But up until the September before, on the day of the rescue, Mallinson would phone him at the exact moment that they were rescued, just after 1 o'clock on the anniversary, and then afterward, at a certain point, they would meet for lunch on that day. Every year, so there was a kind of very close bond that existed as a consequence of the rescue and their experiences down there in the deep.
Did you get to speak to them?
I got to speak to Mallinson a lot, but sadly Roger Chapman had died before I began researching the book. But I spoke to his widow, June Chapman, who was very supportive, and his two sons who were very supportive, and I interviewed Mallinson a lot for the book, along with as many as the rescuers who were still alive. So it was a great pleasure to speak to them, and to feel like to try and effectively illuminate this story, which has been largely forgotten, but it is an incredible tale of heroism, and also that element of what you can do if a team pulls together. There's
something sort of specially nostalgic and kind of beautiful about it, because, as you say, it was the analog age, probably just toward the end of it. But if go ahead.
It's interesting to say that when I was researching the book, I discovered that this was 1973 when the Cantac cable was laid, and as I said, 175 phone calls could be made at any point. But in that same year, the first mobile phone call was made. It was by one developer to another, to his competitor, effectively, to say that they were ahead of the game. And it's one of these my regrets. Actually, I didn't use it as a footnote somewhere, because it was effectively, I just couldn't like the touch of that. So it was an analog age, but it was also the year that the feature. I mean, the feature's birth every year, effectively. But there was that kind of nice touch. But yeah, I mean, this was men in boiler suits with T-squares, trying to fix things. So, I mean, even the device, the toggle that rescued them, I mean, that was designed on paper with T-squares and manufactured in a few hours. In fact, in a nice touch that would appeal to an annealing comedy, when they went over to the fabrication unit, having designed this rescue toggle, they spoke to the foreman and said, "We've got to make this build." And he looked and said, "Yeah, look, we can start it next week." And he said, "No, we did this." So he put him on to Leonard Redshaw. And Redshaw, in no uncertain terms, told them that it would be made today, in fact, this afternoon. And they said, "Right, why didn't you say?" So they made it in the space of a few hours.
Didn't the Queen contact the guys at one point?
Well, that was the great thing. They get a message garbled down from the phone that Queen Elizabeth is thinking well of you. Now, and this was very moving to them, because Chapman had served in the Royal Navy, so you serve Her Majesty, effectively. And Mallinson was also deeply moved this idea that at this hour, their kind of darkest hour, the Queen, the monarch, Britannia, effectively, was thinking well of them, and it kept them going. But it was only until they got to the surface a couple of days later that what it was the QE2 had been steaming past and had offered to assist, but that assistance wasn't required. But they said, "Look, wish the men well." So
it wasn't the Queen at all.
No, it wasn't the Queen. It was the QE2. But the message that they got, and that helped sustain them, was that it was the Queen herself that was wishing them well. So it's best they didn't know.
I'm sure that she would have done as well. Yeah, the video of the guys coming out and the interview with them afterward is peak hard British guy from sort of the mid 1900s. No, it was mostly fine down there. We could have survived for another day or so. It was
Oh, it's I suppose that's what's fascinating about it, is that kind of age where You mean, okay, what was interesting about it is they both gave quite moving interviews, one to the Telegraph, one to the Mail, about a week or so later. But it was that, it's not the days where it's effectively kind of, the cameras brought out, please emote, and please emote copiously. It wasn't like that at all. It was that very British thing of, I've gone through the greatest trauma of my life, but how do I minimise it?
It was but a scratch. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. But that's the benefit of putting together a book like The Dive, whereby you can lay it out. It's only effectively when you lay it out chronologically in as much detail as I've been able to do, where you show everything going wrong and then what's put in place to rectify that. And even remarkable people like, as I say, kind of Ted Carter. I spoke to him about it. So he was down in the submarine. Everything had gone wrong. His colleagues' lives are effectively, literally in his hands, because he's the man who's manipulating this toggle, and he has to get it in. And I asked him about the pressure of that. And in the book, I refer to the fact that, there's like 50 tons of pressure bearing down on the submarine, but internally there should be the same amount bearing down on him. But he was very blasé about it. He just said, "No, I'm not." Some people are just built that way, that they're very under at times of great crisis. They can be very relaxed and very focused. And he was one of those kind of characters whereby he had a job to do, he managed to get it done.
Right man for the job.
And saved his colleague's life along with the rest of the team.
Amazing, man. That's such a fascinating story. I think you've done an awesome job with the book. That'll be linked. The Dive will be linked on Amazon below. Any other bits if people want to learn more about this? Just buy it. Buy The Dive. That's the best way to do it. But it is a fascinating story, and also what I was glad, because also in the book I tell the story of, there's a section where I talk about the development of submarines, but also the laying of the cable back in the kind of 1850s and 60s. This great kind of nautical journey to try and connect the old world and the new is quite an amazing story, and they were this little part of it further down the line. But I hope people will read it, because it is one of those situations whereby it's just the ability of people not giving in, and a team of men rescuing their colleagues. Beautiful story. Stephen McGinty, ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for your time.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that, then press here for a selection of the best clips from the podcast over the last few months. And don't forget to subscribe. It makes me very happy indeed. Peace.